carried. Thank you. So we'll move on to the reports, and I'm just going to make a minor change to the order of these reports and start with 7.2, which is the, sorry, Mr. Taylor, I've got to give you warning of that. We'll start with 7.2, which is the climate change response, and then we'll deal with the actions register after that because they're actually related to one another. So I'll just welcome Mr. Taylor up to present his report. Thank you.
We're on. Ladies and gentlemen, good morning to you. One quick item to begin. I recall from the previous meeting you were interested to know what impact the forestry might be having in terms of removing carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. It's very easy for us to concentrate only on our emissions. Well, I've been doing some work with Craig, our new forestry officer, and we have some as yet unaudited estimates of the value to us of the forestry in absorbing carbon dioxide over the period of the year that we're doing our carbon footprint on. And at a rough figure, 6,486 tonnes of carbon dioxide are being absorbed by that forestry in the past financial year, subject to an audit, but we'll be able to include that in our carbon footprinting. So it's nice to have a little bit of positive alongside the otherwise perhaps negative. The report that I presented to you is just a brief one, 2 pages, but with some visual material alongside it. And because I know how long your meeting is, or series of meetings will be during the day, may I take the report and the images alongside it as read, because you've had a chance to look through that. I'd welcome your questions about it, and I've got a couple of comments that I could make about the report as well, but I'm very happy, Madam Chair, to proceed direct to questions or comments.
Thank you, Mr. Taylor. Do you want to start with your comments and then we'll open up with questions, if that's okay with you?
The context for this work is related quite closely to some very good public engagement activity during the last financial year. This was coordinated for us by an independent worker, a facilitator, and the public engagement in that was really encouraging. We literally had hundreds of people involved in the participation. Several councillors have been along, so you've had a chance to see them firsthand. The job is not completed. It's made very good progress, and the first report on the climate strategy for the district gave us some really good pointers which we're going to use within our own internal work, but there's still more to be done. And so I'm in a position as a worker focused mainly on the internal activity of really welcoming that external contact and that bringing of public interest and focus on climate issues. It would be splendid to be able to continue that. But I'm in your hands as councillors and also that of my senior colleagues as to the commitment to how much we invest in that and if we invest in that. But I wanted to record my concern that the momentum we've started is faltering, and it seems disappointing to have that momentum faltering. In terms of the content of the work, we will be able to be underway on our internal planning as part of the activity plans, building towards the long-term plan for the District Council, so that our response to climate change, both in adaptation and mitigation, can begin. And it's given us the platform for that work. We're also going to connect with work happening across the whole region. There's a mayoral working party on climate issues in which our committee chair and our mayor are both involved. And that regional working group is timed in such a way that we can make use of it and it can make use of our experiences. So there'll be a dialogue between us and our neighbouring councils and the rest of the region. That gives us an opportunity to keep the context. You may have come across the public communications called It's Time Canterbury, saying there's an issue for all of us here. An opportunity for us to connect our work with the work happening across the region. To some extent, we're ahead of our colleagues in other councils because we've done the external strategy work. There'll be other ways in which, no doubt, experience elsewhere, particularly in the larger settlements, is ahead of us because they've had more staff and more time to work on their climate planning. But we're in the game. I'll stop at that, Madam Chair.
I think, yeah, the other point too, of course, we do have an election coming up too, and a change in government could easily change the national focus as well. So we are acutely aware of that. Sure,
thank you. Any questions from councillors? Councillor Booth?
Just, you mentioned the 6,486 tonnes of carbon that's been sequestered by the trees. What happens at the end of their life? Is that released back into the atmosphere, that carbon?
The question is a fair one, because if you log and remove all those trees and turn it into pasture, then yes, you've got an effect in terms of you're losing your carbon storage. But much of the forestry grown here is intended to be replanted, and it will either be replanted as further conifer forestry, or it will be planted or allowed to regenerate as native bush, which also stores carbon. So we can note the benefit that there's carbon storage going on, but if we were to log and clear the whole lot, or some disastrous weather event felled the whole lot, then we would have a loss. And the carbon credits that were banked when we first registered this forestry, the pre-1990 forest, those carbon credits are there to help insure us against that risk. So we do have some carbon credits that we can use for that purpose.
I guess what I'm getting at is what's the point? Because you're actually basically storing them, and then they're going to ultimately die, or you're going to cut them, and that tonnage you've sequestered goes back into the atmosphere. So what's the point?
I missed your comment, Mr. Councillor Burt, sorry.
Sorry, I suppose it's that principle of it. It's not storing it; it's processing it, as opposed to once you cut it down, it's returned to the atmosphere.
Depends on what happens to that timber. If the timber is used, for example, in building construction or in some other durable use, then you're not releasing it to the atmosphere. Obviously, if you burn it or you put it into your landfill, then yes, you're turning it into gases. It's all to do with flows and balance. There's a flow of some carbon from the atmosphere into the forestry on our land, which would not be happening if it was a different land use.
Any other questions, Councillor Shannon?
Thank you. I'm most interested in some of the actions around resilience and what's obviously happening right here and now, and when we don't have to look too far back to some of the flooding around, in particular around the ward in which I live. This is what it's quite handy to have both infrastructure and yourself here, actually, Reece. How much work has already been done or is going to be done, most urgently, I suppose, really, with regards to the some of the residential aspects of where our streams are through some of our towns and the lights, and are we just going to see more reports about this, or are there going to be actions specifically that are going to help some of our people to avoid some of those things like we've seen around the country where we've had to buy out properties and the likes?
Yeah, we are doing quite a bit of work through the district plan, the new proposed district plan in that area regarding flooding. So overland flow paths are now taken into account, and we do, we model every development that comes in, we model it and see what the floor height should be, the minimum floor height, to protect those properties against, or houses in particular, against flooding. So that is, there is of course coastal erosion going on. That is really, we're working with ECAN on that one. And I think at some stage in the future we will have to have some sort of retreat strategy, potentially, as the erosion occurs. So that has certainly been in discussion at the moment. There's no plan as such, but we are aware of that issue. Yeah.
So we're going to see some of this come through in time for what we're working on with the LTP right now. Again, just focusing residential on the coastal erosion and what have you. Everybody's been well aware of that, but it's the town stuff I'm concerned about at this point.
Yeah, in addition to, we're looking at our bridges, the resilience of those, where it's certainly considered in every bridge replacement program. What is the minimum height it should be above a river? So these are all sort of taken in. It's a little bit of BAU in many ways, but it's certainly that climate change consideration is definitely coming into the decision making.
Just to add to that, Madam Chair, in our work on the activity plans, which are preparation for the long-term plan, there are now useful discussions happening in the office about the climate dimension to work, which is being tackled as business as usual. Only yesterday I was having a lengthy discussion with the manager of the solid waste team about how aspects of climate awareness were built into their waste plan. So we're trying to make this an all-of-organisation awareness.
Thank you. Any other questions? Councillor Jackson.
Reece, you've spoken about setting up a trust as an independent entity as part of the Timaru District Climate Change Strategy. So what other trusts have been set up? Are there any other models that you're looking at sort of exploring and maybe copying some of the good work they might have done?
We have locally at least one charitable trust which has an interest in matters of sustainability, and I believe that there's been some discussion between the mayor and the chair of that trust to see if this is part of their focus, and they've identified that while it might be interesting to do so, they've got a really full commitment of other activities. So there isn't a ready-made local body. Some of the focus on economic impacts of climate change would fall within the purview of Venture Timaru, and therefore it's one of their interests. And the Chamber of Commerce have a conference on sustainability coming up later this year, which will be touching on these issues. But there isn't a ready-made local body. And the proposal that came from the advisory group working with Dr. Driver was that, if possible, an independent trust or some such body was set up with a focus on South Canterbury, possibly inviting interest from Waimati and Mackenzie as well. It wouldn't necessarily have to be just Timaru, and that such a body could, as an independent gatherer and sharer of information, provide a useful service to us and to the wider economy and the wider society. That idea hasn't progressed very far yet, not for lack of merit, but for the energy being invested in setting it up. I mentioned earlier that I'm personally interested in this happening.
But yeah, our initial focus is focused on looking at what council can do in regard to climate change, first and foremost, and then there is that other issue, which is what the community can do, and that's the community side is what the trust or similar entity, and it doesn't have to be a trust, and that's something we need to look at here. And the other debate that's going to be had is what level of support should council have. Potentially that's an LTP issue.
I know that within the public and the participants in that strategy work, there's an energy and impatience to keep going, and so we'd be seen to be moving slowly in comparison to their energy. So I'm personally keen that it stays on our agenda.
But climate change, of course, does tend to attract very passionate people. So.
Thank you. Any other questions from councillors? No. So I just have one question myself, Mr. Taylor. So I really appreciate that the report that you've put together. I think it clearly sets out the work that you and council are doing in this space, which is actually quite a lot. You know, and some people may feel that we've stopped with not continuing on that public working group, but I feel like we're still doing a lot. And although we don't have the supposed holy grail of a glossy strategy with fancy pictures, I can see that you've taken the work that Dr. Phil Driver and the advisory group presented and considered how we integrate that into the council's long-term plan, because any climate change strategy needs to interlink with the long-term plan. Alongside this, you're also working on council's internal response to climate change and collaborating with other councils that you've demonstrated in that report. And it seems like you're doing this without a huge amount of additional resource that was anticipated. So my question to you is, where is your time best spent if council wants to take actions that have the best outcome for our environment and our community? Sorry, that was quite a long-winded question.
Well, Madam Chair, I expect to concentrate in this month, in September, on completing that council-wide data gathering for the carbon inventory. That's our timetable for that. 2/3 of it is done. And I'll also be working on the activity plan for climate work for the council, again, to meet the internal deadlines for long-term plan briefing material. Colleagues will need that from me this month. In October, I will have the opportunity to work on the beginnings of a climate action plan for Timaru District Council. And that, again, is timed to be early enough to influence the long-term plan. It'll also begin to connect with the mayoral forum activity. So I think that time is going to be okay. We expect to receive proposals and ideas from the Mayoral Forum Climate Partnership, and they will include some ideas which will seek co-funding by all councils. So this is the Mayoral Forum driving this work, and the co-funding will be requested is based on population size. So Christchurch puts in an awful lot more than we do, but we look, there'll be a request there for us to take part. That will also be timed to fit into the long-term plan, budget planning. Commencing in November, I'll be contributing to joint work with Environment Canterbury's coastal specialists and our emergency management team, and we'll be trying to begin to offer some help to coastal communities who are most at risk from sea inundation and erosion. The work on that will take several years, but it'll be led initially by our emergency response colleagues, so that in the event of a combination of very high river flows and storm events from the sea and so on, they've got an emergency response. But alongside that, we'll be doing some work which my colleague was referring to as a managed retreat discussion, at least opening that discussion, so that their welfare and their safety is thought about in the longer term. But that will begin in November. Having some additional staff resource for climate change advice would speed up progress in most of these areas. Interested that you mentioned that. But that recruitment needs to be considered by the Chief Executive alongside other priorities for staff investment. And finally, just to reiterate my earlier point, it would be helpful to see continuation of the independently facilitated work in the wider community. That public engagement and commitment, led by the council, or at least supported or sponsored by the council, is a really good and powerful combination of work. And as you know, I came into this level of government work from the wider community. I've been involved in non-government organisations for much of my career. I tend to have that perspective, and I'm interested in how the wider public can help us and we can help them. That's probably sufficient in terms of diary, but it's a fairly full diary, Madam Chair.
No, I appreciate that. I just actually have one follow-up question about your work with the coastal communities. Will that also involve the landowners between the two communities that are having some serious effects on their land along there, or were you thinking about just Milford and Rangitata Huts?
I think in terms of, should we say, risk to life and limb, it would be sensible for us to offer our assistance initially to Milford Huts and then subsequently to work with others. Our focus probably should be on the well-being of people, followed by the economic and the other aspects, environmental aspects. It's a very complex topic, and there are a lot of participants involved, and so it would be wrong for me to first guess what we do. The discussion with the local people is so important.
Yeah, we certainly are seeing as ECAN as a key,
They'll be involved.
are leading it, and will be in support of it. Yeah.
I would just offer some support to some of those landowners and their well-being as well, because the situations they're facing out there is having a serious effect on their well-being. So I wouldn't underestimate that, would be my caution. Anyway, I think we're done with questions. Were there any further questions? I'll ask Councillor Piddington.
Yeah, look, I think we've got to focus on what we can do in this space, and the request for a second climate change officer. We need to be rigorous about these things before we create roles, and I'm not sure about an independent facilitator going back out into the community and raising expectations that we can't deliver. So I'd approach that with real caution till we as a group have decided what we want to do and how we're going to do it. Because there's a number of organisations that give good information about climate change, and I don't want to be replicating that or have someone counting numbers for the sake of counting numbers.
Yeah, thank you, Councillor Piddington, and I kind of aligned with your thinking, which is why I was keen especially to make sure this is integrated with the long-term plan and we're not shooting off doing one thing and then doing another in our long-term plan. So even though it feels like we've pushed pause, it's for good reason that we make sure those are aligned. And we haven't actually pushed pause because there's still a lot of work happening, isn't there, Mr Taylor?
Just through the chair too, I think it's very important that we work very closely with the mayoral forum work and leverage off the what's going on a regional basis.
Thank you. With no further questions, I'll ask if somebody would like to move the recommendation, which is that the Environmental Services Committee receives and notes the report, being the update on the Timaru climate change response. Thank you, Mayor Bowen, and do I have a second? Thank you, Councillor Oliver. All in favour, say aye. Against? Carried. Thank you. I'll just actually invite both of you just to stay there if you wish, because our next report is kind of relevant that Mr Dixon may want to respond to or not. So we'll move on to report 7.1. Just bear with me while I bring that up. So this was just an actions register update. So the recommendation is just to receive a note, but there was an action from a previous committee meeting requested for the role of a second climate change officer has progressed and the scope discussed with the Mayor, Chairperson, Deputy Chair of the Environmental Services Committee. The update is there saying that a review has been undertaken on the scope, how to best resource it, and funding and priorities are also a consideration. So did you want to add anything to that, Mr Dixon, or just it is what it is?
Yeah, thank you, Madam Chair. Just as previously noted, you know, when we look at new positions, we have to look at priorities across the business, and that has to be balanced up against, you know, perhaps health and safety, and finance side of things. We have a long-term plan coming up. So these things are important considerations, and I think, yeah, we also, as I was saying before, you know, leverage off other areas that can assist us rather than rushing in. Yeah, in an ideal world, lots of resources are always good. It can make the ship move faster, but is this a priority at this point in time? I would question that, and that's why we are, I guess, just undertaking that review and saying where is the priorities.
Thank you. Any questions on that? No. If somebody would like to move the recommendation. Thank you, Mayor Bowen. Anyone else? Thank you, Councillor Parker. All in favour? Against? Carried. Okay. Where are we next? So we had no items of urgent business or minor nature, so we'll move to item 10, which is the... Oh, sorry, thank you very much, Mr Dixon, Mr Taylor. Thank you. We'll move to item 10, which is